What are the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, and what is their significance for the Buddhist tradition? What are the implications of these pronouncements for Buddhist philosophy and for Buddhist practice? In this video lecture, I'll get at some of these questions with a focus on the Noble Truths themselves and also implications of these truths for Buddhist philosophy, particularly in the no self doctrine, and also for Buddhist practice in the form of meditation. It should be noted from the outset that the Four Noble Truths are not some sort of creedal doctrinal statement. They're meant to encapsulate the insight that the Buddha achieved, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, achieved under the Bodhi tree some 2,500 years ago. And the Buddha turned around and started teaching, and these Four Noble Truths were designed to encapsulate his insights in a crisp, memorable form for his early followers. And the very first sermon that the Buddha issued was, in fact, focused on the Four Noble Truths. They do not represent a stepwise instruction manual. They are not meant to be followed 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you're done. They actually hang together. They're a synthetic vision of a problem, a way of confronting it, and an ultimate goal. And that's the way we'll be seeing them here today. Four Noble Truths are the truth of suffering, or dukkha, the truth of the arising of suffering, or samudaya, the cessation of suffering, or nirodha, and the Noble Eightfold Path, or the Marga. Sometimes the Four Noble Truths are thought about via a medical scheme, and this does make some sense. The truth of suffering, that all is suffering, as it's often translated, is in fact the disease that afflicts us as human beings. Suffering afflicts us as the disease, or perhaps the symptom of a disease. There is a cause to the disease, which corresponds to the second noble truth. And there's the idea of being cured of the disease, which is the cessation of suffering. And then there is, in fact, a medicine that addresses the cause and thus interrupts and eliminates the disease, and that corresponds to the Noble Eightfold Path. So the first noble truth, this is the noble truth of suffering, that birth is suffering, aging, sickness, dying, sorrow, grief, pain, unhappiness, and unease are suffering. Being united with what is not liked is suffering. Separation from what it is liked is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, the five aggregates of grasping are suffering, the five crucial components of the self. It is all imbued with suffering. This sounds like a rather negative view of the world, but from the Buddhist perspective, it is simply realistic. It is simply the way things are. Dukkha is translated, most often translated suffering, but that might be a little misleading in English because suffering tends to connote some sort of dramatic anguish or angst or pain or affliction or something along those lines. All of that, as you just saw from the scriptures themselves, are included within this idea of suffering, but it is more nuanced in the Buddhist tradition. Maybe better translated instability or dis-ease or something along those lines. A constant feeling, even if it's suppressed or is pushed into the background, that things are shifting, things are changing, things won't always remain the same, that the world that's out there in front of us is not a certain world, and the world within us is also not a certain world. And we always have the kind of edgy feeling, right, that the other shoe is going to drop in some sense. So suffering, yes, good is a shorthand, but it's more nuanced than that. There are three kind of official categories of suffering within Buddhist teaching as the Buddha expanded on the First Noble Truth. There is simple pain, of course, physical pain, disease, and trauma and injury and all those kinds of things. There's psychological pain that we undergo when we experience difficulty and loss and disappointment and all those kinds of things. The psychological suffering or pain is often linked, according to this teaching, to the truth of impermanence, namely that all things are impermanent and they will inevitably transform and change. We will encounter things that we don't like, which is the pain associated with aversion. We will encounter things that we do like that we lose, which is, of course, the pain that goes with a detachment from things that we are attached to. Impermanence is an ultimate and crucial source of our suffering, from grand moments of suffering to everyday moments of suffering where we don't get exactly what we want, or we have things taken away from us, or things break, or those kinds of things. Then there's the truth of the suffering that goes with conditioned existence, which is slightly more technical, but it is the idea that we are made of constantly transforming component parts. And this, we'll talk a bit more about the Buddhist concept of the self in a few minutes, but the idea that we attach to ultimately to our selves as an entity or an ego or something along those lines, which misperceives us, is a misperception, a self-misperception about the reality of things. It is the ultimate attachment to the self as a self that leads to the other forms of suffering. It is the premise of attaching to anything to have an I that attaches to it. So if I want, I love, I hate, I dislike, all behind all of that is a concept of an I that is somehow at the center of these acts. And the truth of conditioned existence is simply reinforcing that the idea that that kind of attachment is in fact illusory. So we move on to the second noble truth, which is about the origin of suffering, the thirst for repeated existence. And remember, we're in the samsaric worldview here. So the constant cycle from birth to rebirth, repeated over and over again, is a product of karma and desire for more in the Buddhist scheme. And this is part of the origin of suffering. This desire for repeated existence is associated with delight and greed, delights in this and that, namely the thirst for the objects of sense desire, the thirst for existence, and the thirst for non-existence. So much of this makes intuitive sense, right? That is, we're constantly in pursuit of the next thing, the next pleasure, the next delight, the next happiness. It's a kind of conveyor belt or hamster wheel that we find ourselves on. And so we really are very much distracted by the objects of sense desire, and also for more existence, more lifetimes, more experience, more recognition, an extension of ourselves in our progeny. We want more, right? Relentlessly more. Also embedded here, however, is the thirst for the non-existence of things that we don't like. So there are things that we do not want, and we work really, really hard to avoid them, whether that's people or things or objects or etc. It's ingrained in our nature to have this thirst for the non-existence of things. If you walk by a very dirty dumpster in a city street and you're immediately hit by that awful smell, you can see how deeply ingrained in us and in our nature this thirst for the non-existence of that smell is, right? And so our life, our experience is rife with those kinds of experiences, the desire for non-existence as well as the desire for more of the things that we do like. This leads to what we might call the duality of thirst or craving. Um, on one hand, for more of what we want and what we like and what we're attached to, things, pleasure, happiness, existence, rebirth, people, etc., right? And then for none of what we don't want, on unpleasant things, displeasure, sadness, and of course, ultimately, death. So we retreat from that and we live in a state of an attachment to the non-existence of these things. And yet, especially in the case of death, they are in fact inevitable. This is sounding rather dismal at this point, but again, from the Buddhist perspective, we're simply contending with reality and the reality of the human condition. But there is a way out, according to the Buddha. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, the complete fading away and cessation of this very thirst. It's abandoning, relinquishing, releasing, and letting go. So the Buddha says it's possible to eliminate the cause of the disease, right? To allow for the cessation or to engage in practice that enables us to cease this thirst and this craving that drives is the cause of the disease. This cessation has a specific name and conceptual world that's built around it, and that is nirvana. When we're able to cease the craving and uproot the cause of the suffering, according to the Buddha's teaching, we are able to escape the bonds of that suffering and escape the bonds, therefore, of samsara, which is fueled by our own desire and fueled by the karma that we generate. And we are able to attain a state of release and relinquishment and letting go. And that state goes under the label of nirvana, which is a blowing out, literally, a kind of blowing out of the flame. If you think about our existence, lifetime after lifetime, as a candle flame constantly flickering, right? Constantly shifting and changing, but maintaining some sort of continuity along the way, then nirvana would be the blowing out of the candle. A process of nirvana-ing, as it were, the process of being, cultivating and constantly striving for this state is essential to what many forms of Buddhism are all about. Nirvana is conceived in many different ways in the Buddhist tradition and Buddhist worlds. It is, at least based on the historical Buddha's story, a kind of immediate experience. That as he attains it, it hits him under the Bodhi tree. He works up towards it, and then he has this immediate experience. But then we know that the Buddha continues to wander around in the world for several more decades. So is he enlightened? The answer is yes. He's in nirvana, as it were. So this leads to another interpretation of nirvana as a kind of state of mind, a state of being. And the Buddha's example suggests that we can attain that state and still be in the world in some sense, even though in the Buddhist tradition, he's ultimately attaining nirvana at his death, and that is the ultimate nirvana. But nirvana must maybe has some quality of a kind of state of mind that we can maintain even in this lifetime. Nirvana then also, from a kind of more mythological standpoint, becomes a kind of place or place where Buddhas or enlightened beings reside. So more of a spatial understanding of what nirvana is and where it is. So it has a number of different layers to it, even in the early phases of the tradition. But certainly, without doubt, demarcates the moment where suffering ends because the cause of suffering has been uprooted and ultimately leads to escape from the cycle of birth and rebirth. Then we arrive at the fourth noble truth, which is, as you'll recall, is the medicine. So this is the means to the end of uprooting the cause of suffering. And this one's a path that, again, it's not a linear path. It's a set of principles and practices and guidelines, right, that will all build together, right, to ultimately produce that effect, right, of uprooting the cause of suffering. So we have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Generally, the Noble Eightfold Path is broken down or categorized in three um, different areas of emphasis. Under wisdom, right view, for example, is understanding of Buddhist teachings, right? And doctrines, pronouncements like the Four Noble Truths. There's conduct, Shila, which is about our ethical behavior pertaining to speech and our actions in the world, and also the livelihood or vocation that we choose. And then the third aspect it focuses in on meditation, and we'll be looking at meditation a little bit further in a few moments. These are the aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path. So when it comes to meditation, this is quoting from the scholar Damien Keown. Meditation might be defined as an altered state of consciousness which is induced, in a controlled manner. An altered state of consciousness which is induced in a controlled manner. And the Buddha became quite expert at meditation and meditative techniques as a result of his time in the forest with the forest dwellers, those who were in pursuit of the truth of Atman and Brahman and moksha. And remember that the Buddha himself ultimately checked out of that group because he needed to pursue his own path towards enlightenment, but he learned quite a bit from those figures out in the forest. What are the goals of meditation? Well, I guess in common parlance, we might say relaxation is, of course, the way that the practice has been appropriated by many in the Western world as a means to de-stress or something along those lines. But even in its kind of origins and its Buddhist practice, certainly a kind of tranquility is an important element or a premise of further attainments within meditation and meditative practice. Another aspect of meditation is the attempt to purify the mind of those desires and aversions, to identify those moments, those thoughts that lead to attachment or desires that are not healthy, to acknowledge them in a sense and to attempt to dispel them, or maybe more correctly, to let them go, let them pass, because they do pass. So the practice of meditation is certainly about purification of our desires and the amplification of positive values, like, for example, compassion and loving kindness meditation. So purification of the mind is a broad goal within many meditative techniques. Then we get to higher states, and Buddhism builds on its Vedic precedents and has the idea that there are a number of higher states of awareness that can be achieved through meditation and through lengthy effort, right? And and they can be achieved, and as a result, the meditator can achieve higher levels of awareness, right, about themselves and their world. And this really was the Buddha's kind of innovation in a sense, is that he not only wanted to attain these states, but wanted to reflect, use those states in a sense to reflect on the self, to become mindful of the self and the nature of the self. And ultimately, the realization there, when this awareness is turned inward, is that there is no self. And ultimately, Buddhist meditation is oriented around that very realization, not only understanding it, but in a sense, experiencing uh, no self and avoiding the idea of ego and of Atman or self. So that's really, in many ways, the ultimate orientation of early Buddhist meditation. So what is this idea of no self? It is very important and underlies the Four Noble Truths and the attempt to escape the world of suffering. It is in some ways, the ultimate impediment to achieving those goals, the idea of the self. So achieving this realization is absolutely crucial in the Buddhist tradition. This is one of the ways that Buddhism really is in stark contrast to the tradition from which it arose, namely Brahmanism, and in particular, the teachings of the Upanishads, and which are absolutely essential within most branches of Hinduism, yogic Buddhism, or yogic Hinduism, etc. Um, that idea from the Upanishads is that there is an essential ultimate self, right, that resides within us and in all things. And it is the same, it is continuous, and it is linked on the flip side of the coin to something called Brahman, ultimate reality, ultimate divine substance that resides in all things. It is eternal, unchanging, and only clouded from us by our own attachment to individuality and our own illusions, right? And so the idea is to engage in meditation to attain realization of this eternal unity, right, which is at our essence. And at that moment, the all of the rivers flow into the ocean and become one, in a sense, liberating us from ignorance and illusion. Um, the Buddhist teaching is radically against the idea of an essential self. Um, the self is not some intense metaphysical entity or essence that resides within us. It is simply a conventional label we put on a collection of parts, according to Buddhism. Um, there is a famous dialogue between King Milinda and the monk Nagasena, where Nagasena challenges the king to find the essence of a chariot. And he goes about this by enumerating the different parts of the chariot, say is the wheel, the chariot is the axle, the chariot is the chair in the back, the chariot is the pole, the chariot, etc. None of them are the chariot. So where exactly does the chariot arise? The chariot is a name for that collection of parts that we use. For many forms, as I've said, of Buddhism, this is the key realization. If you want to let go of craving and attachment, which in turn produces suffering because of the reality of impermanence, we have to let go of the self, which is the premise of the entire process. Aggrandizing the self, right, as we find among the forest dwellers and in the Upanishads, raising it up like those texts do, is ultimately a mistake from the Buddhist perspective, right? So if there is no self, then what are we? What are the parts? Buddhism proposes that there are five aggregates, as they're usually called, five parts of us. right, that we lump together and call a self, but actually they're just five different components that are constantly interweaving and interacting with each other. And you can see them here, the actual physical body, sensations, immediate sensations, the conceptions that we form of our experience, the formation of our character, which is constituted, among other things, by karma, and then consciousness, or the sense that we are here, and a kind of awareness. If we lump all these together, then we have something called a self, but we don't really have anything that is the self. The self is simply the label that we put on the constantly shifting and changing aggregates, these five components that are in constant flux and change, and also constant interaction with each other. So let's step back for a second and think about how a prominent theorist of religion might look at all of this, looking in from the outside. And I'm selecting Paul Tillich, who is pretty famous within religious studies circles. He is actually a Christian theologian, but his ideas have been appropriated by many to investigate religious phenomena and to try to discern the ultimate truth about religion and to understand and interpret it. Paul Tillich, the 20th century Christian theologian, is famously made an argument for the nature of religion uh, that is based on an understanding of existentialism, the philosophical movement in the 20th century that emphasized the kind of tragic situation that human beings face, especially in relation to our mortality. We recognize ourselves as finite and mortal and look at the world around us and wonder what the meaning is, particularly in the face of that mortality. And that produces a certain degree of alienation and angst and depression. And existentialism and naming the human condition has a number of different forms. There are a number of different thinkers who have different answers to this predicament that we find ourselves in. But Tillich did accept this philosophical analysis of the human condition, but then said that existentialism poses the question to us, the question of our meaning and of our existence. But then, unlike most secular existentialists, philosophers in the 20th century, suggested that religion provides the answer. Most philosophical existentialists in the 20th century would have argued that religion is a distraction. It's running away from our condition, and which we need to confront authentically as ourselves and not try to run away from it in things like religion, which supposedly gives us the answers. Tillich rejected that and said that religion was the only way to get the answers, right? Now, he was coming at it from a Christian perspective, so his answer, while unorthodox, is definitely a Christian answer, namely that God and a figure like Jesus really were the answer. But he did devise a scheme where he opened up to dialogue with other religious traditions and has a set of concepts that he thought might be more broadly applicable. Um, Especially this idea of preliminary versus ultimate concern. As you can see in this definition of religion, Tillich says that religion is the state of being grasped by an ultimate concern, a concern which qualifies all other concerns as preliminary, and which itself contains the answer to the question of the meaning of our life. Preliminary concerns are the everyday, and to this extent, he would agree with existentialists, or existentialists would agree with him, that we usually escape the fundamental problems of meaning that confront us because of our mortality and the contingency of our existence. We usually run away from that reality via preliminary concerns. right? Whether it's hobbies or recreation or more serious things like profession, careers, money, possessions, et cetera, right? And we use those to run away from our broader condition. Our entire life, in some sense, is a midlife crisis, right? According to this scheme, and that's what Tillich asserted. But if we really want to confront the essential problems instead of running away from them, we discover an answer that is an ultimate concern and occupy ourselves with that ultimate concern. We are grasped by that ultimate concern. Now, of course, in the Western tradition, that ultimate concern is God or Jesus or those kinds of figures, and we find those kinds of figures in many different religious traditions. And that's kind of the idea of the ultimate concern for the study of religion, is that it asks us to try to discern the ultimate concern in different traditions. So how can we apply this to the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism? Well, there is the truth of mortality and suffering, which uh, kind of mirrors Tillich's idea, or Tillich's idea mirrors Buddhism, in identifying our predicament, our fundamental situation, which does in Buddhism also have a lot to do with attachment to preliminary concerns, and of course, aversion from the things we don't want to be concerned with. So, to that extent, Tillich does light up this area of significance that's identified within his theory, and we can discern it within the Buddhist scheme as well. But where does the ultimate concern reside within Buddhism, if we can apply that term to this tradition? Is it the Buddha? Well, in some forms of Buddhism, a Buddha does seem to be the ultimate answer, that being that renders all other concerns as preliminary, as important as they might be. A Buddha is, in some cases, the being that resolves those issues for us, for practitioners. But in traditional forms of Buddhism, or in Theravada Buddhism, it really does seem that nirvana is the ultimate concern, not the Buddha. The Buddha is just the messenger, and the Buddha does say that my teaching is just a raft to get you across the river. And once you're across the river, get rid of the raft, right? It's about the goal. It's about alleviating suffering. It's about escaping the cycle of samsara. It's about attaining nirvana. And that's not going to happen by attaching to the teaching or attaching to the teacher, right? So the Buddha in this sense is merely the midwife. And so the Buddha is pointing the way. The historical Buddha is pointing the way towards the ultimate concern, that which is absolute, unconditional, grasps us, right? And preoccupies us, right? And the search for nirvana, right? The quest for nirvana is the concern that preoccupies us and renders everything else preliminary, according to Tillich's scheme. Does that application of that theory from Tillich work? Well, there could be considerable discussion and debate about that. But I will leave it there and